Lauren Bradford is Foundation Center's own Director of Global Partnerships and also manages the SDG philanthropy platform, including sdgfunders.org, amongst other major products and relationships. She joined Foundation Center to create a global strategy to develop and manage bilateral and multilateral partnerships. These relationships have become instrumental in fulfilling Foundation Center's vision to build a knowledge base for philanthropy and strengthen the philanthropic sector to achieve more effective grant-making and development outcomes. Lauren has degrees in both urban planning and international development and understands the global development framework and its relationship to data, including the creation and implementation of the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the financing of the post-2015 Development Agenda. Karolina Mizek-Kalias has led the United Nations Development Program Philanthropy Strategic Relations since January 2013. During this time, she has been instrumental in facilitating a global conversation between the UN, foundations, and governments on enhanced collaboration for the Sustainable Development Goals. Since November 2014, she has led a global team working in Kenya, Ghana, Indonesia, Colombia, Turkey, and Zambia in instituting multi-stakeholder approaches to implementation of the national development plans inspired by the SDGs. During this time, Karolina developed partnerships with global foundations, including Conrad and Hilton, Ford, the MasterCard, Gates, Coca-Cola, DHL foundations. Karolina is an author of many articles, blogs, and has contributed to publications, all available on her LinkedIn profile. Jeffrey Zuckman is a policy advisor in the Office of Policy in USAID's Bureau for Policy Planning and Learning. In that role, he works on a number of the agency's priority development issues, including implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. He also leads on issues related to sustainable urbanization and represents USAID on the U.S. National Preparatory Committee for the United Nations Conference on Housing and Sustainable Urban Development. He joined USAID in 2012 and is an AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow. Prior to joining USAID, he was Assistant Professor of Global Studies at Zayed University in Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates. He also holds a BA from Brandeis University and an MA and PhD in Near Eastern Languages and Cultures from UCLA. And finally, Ana Marie Argelagos is currently a senior advisor at the Ford Foundation's Just Cities and Metropolitan Opportunities Initiatives, and a professor of international urban planning at New York University's Wagner Graduate School of Public Service. Previously, she created the Office for International and Philanthropic Innovation at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, where she served as its first Deputy Assistant Secretary and also served as a Deputy Chief of Staff overseeing agency operations. Before rejoining HUD, she spent 8 years as a Senior Program Officer at the Annie E. Casey Foundation in Baltimore, where she spearheaded the foundation's work in Indian country and along the U.S.-Mexico border. Ms. Argelagos received her BA in International Relations from the American University and her master's degree in Public Administration from Harvard University. And so without further ado, our moderator, Lauren.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Really great to see so many people interested in the SDGs and how you can connect them to your own work. So just to start the presentation and conversation today, I'm just going to give you a brief overview of how the SDGs came about. And so originally, the MDGs were actually the starting point for global development, and there were other frameworks for global development even prior to that. But the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, are the most recent, I guess, and clearest in many of our minds anyway. So the Millennium Development Goals were 8 goals that were set up by the UN in the year 2000 to reduce poverty in developing countries by the year 2015. Then as we started to approach that deadline, the UN and its member states, along with civil society, the private sector, academia, and philanthropy, started to plan what we should do next. And so all of these stakeholders, not just the UN, worked together over the next 3 years from approximately 2012 to 2015 on what we knew as the post-2015 development agenda. And that development agenda included the creation of the Sustainable Development Goals, and it also related to the climate conversation and COP21 that we saw in Paris last year, as well as financing for development process that we also saw last year. And so the Sustainable Development Goals are 17 universal, meaning they apply to all countries, not just developing countries this time, 17 universal development goals that are set to be achieved over the next 15 years and have a focus on the social, environmental and economic dimensions of development to not just reduce poverty this time, but to eradicate poverty by 2030. And so we have 17 goals, 169 targets and 231 indicators to galvanize the world to measure its progress in achieving the goals. So just to tell you a little bit more about the SDGs and how we're working towards the SDGs. So as we mentioned earlier, there is a program called the SDG Philanthropy Platform, and it has a website, sdgfunders.org. And so recently we essentially took the Sustainable Development Goals and took all of the data that Foundation Center has in its database, which is mostly US giving and some international giving, and crosswalked this data to the Sustainable Development Goals from 2010 to 2013 to create a picture of what funding to the SDGs would have looked like if they existed at that time period, and to highlight to foundations and organizations all around the world that philanthropy already is working towards the SDGs, even though it may seem like a new framework. And so as you can see on the screen, the total that we came up with for that period of time was approximately $97 billion. And that's not a full number or a full picture, because that's purely based on the data that we have, which is by far not comprehensive, but we would like it to be. And so this data also includes financial giving, for example, from the US to the US. I'm calling in from Spain right now. It includes foundation funding from Spanish organizations to Spanish organizations, and it includes US giving to Spain, for example. So it's not just focused on developing countries. And the reason it's important to highlight philanthropy's contribution to the development ecosystem is to highlight that in comparison to other donors such as government, private sector, etc., that philanthropy does have a role to play in development globally. And it is a contributor not just in terms of grant making, but in terms of human capital. And now I'm going to hand over to Karolina to tell us a bit more about the actual development of the SDGs and the implementation of the SDGs.
Thank you very much, Lauren. And thank you very much, everyone, for being here and being interested in SDGs. And while Lauren is calling from Spain, I'm actually calling from Greece. And a couple of days ago, I was walking around visiting local ancient sites, and I saw this inscription on the wall made by Archimedes, a very famous Greek ancient philosopher and mathematician. And he said, "Give me a place to stand on, and I will move the earth." Well, of course, what he meant was that in principle, with a large enough lever and a place to stand, the strength needed to move even something as heavy as earth would be possible. And I think that this is what the SDGs are. They are providing us a platform with very clear, succinct, and measurable goals. And when, like Lauren said, it's a very comprehensive agenda with all these 17 goals, 241 indicators, 169 targets. But if we work together and we understand how to collaborate on these goals, it is possible to achieve this vision. And it is indeed possible to create a positive impact, a real impact on these goals and on that vision. And we already have a very important lesson learned, because the predecessor of the SDGs were the Millennium Development Goals. And they also gave us these measurable goals and clear and succinct, not 17, but rather 8. But thanks to them, much of the development aid and a lot of energy and a lot of innovations were actually channeled through these 8 goals. And it made possible for the world to actually cut poverty in half. So even something as large, as comprehensive as Agenda 2030 can have a potential to make a real difference. Now, obviously, the world has changed since the MDGs were instituted, and the principles that you see on the slide really reflect today's thinking about development. First is what Lauren said. It is universal. The Sustainable Development Goals are valid in Detroit, in Kuala Lumpur, and in Nairobi. Everybody has development to do. We all have to develop. The United States, Poland, Romania, Soviet Union, and Australia. What is important is that the second principle is the fact that this agenda is about combining three dimensions, combining social, economic, as well as environmental protection into one development framework. The integrated approach means that there will be trade-offs, but we have to know how to manage them. And the last one, leaving no one behind. That's actually a call to go beyond the national averages. We have to understand who are the most vulnerable and disadvantaged groups in countries or in any kind of community where we work. And as a foundation, that's a very important call, because only if we manage to deliver for those who are really left behind, we will be able to realize that vision. And what's very important to actually make it possible is data, and specifically disaggregated data. What we see now is that, as I mentioned before, the sweet spot between the three areas is very limited. That means that while we, for example, a very obvious example, while we want to pursue growth, it shouldn't be at any cost. It shouldn't be, for example, at the cost of the environmental degradation. So we all should understand what are the kind of pathways where countries actually can pursue strategies which respond to these three dimensions simultaneously. And for example, my own agency where I work advises governments, specifically from those poor countries, on what are these successful pathways. And moreover, I think it's very important that that all foundations and everyone that's working in the development as such should also give aid for those programs and those projects which also find this kind of sweet spot. Now, this next slide really shows the kind of roadmap that each country will follow through to integrate, or what we call domesticate, sustainable development goals. So we have something around alignment, and then we need to make sure that these goals are integrated in the national development plans and so forth. But I wanted to stress one thing. What is really important is the politics behind it. That means that governments have to create space, political space, for all of us to have a public-private dialogue and first of all understand what SDGs mean for every country, and then also prioritize which goals should be tackled first, and then have a conversation who contributes what and what are the kind of mechanisms behind this cross-sector collaboration, because no organization, no country, nobody is able to achieve the goals on its own. And there are, within these goals, a very important aspect, and something which will be really gaining in importance over the next years, months and years, is something which is called the SDG Accelerators. And these are the kind of pressure points which can have multiple positive impacts on many goals. So we would like to pursue catalytic actions which have impact on multiple SDG targets. And this is where we will have big wins. Of course, this will require much more research, much more experimentation. And this is one of the areas where we hope that philanthropy is going really to come in big because of your commitment to innovate and to experiment to pursue the patient capital. And for example, one such an area which is very important and what we sometimes call a silver bullet is women's empowerment. And aid programs which provide women's opportunities for better health, education, jobs, incomes have effect beyond individual. A woman multiplies the impact of the investment by extending benefits to the world around her, to her children as well as to her community. And just, two statistics. First of all, girls who stay in school for 7 or more years marry 4 years later and have fewer children. That means that we have women that are able to take a conscious choice about their families. Women make up only 43% of agriculture, labor force, and are much less likely to own land. But at the same time, the evidence shows that if they have crops, the crops have 10% higher yield than those owned by men, and more of these kind of examples. So these are that's just one idea of this accelerator, but there are others, such as, for example, sustainable energy. But we collectively need to have a much bigger research and much bigger investment of what are these accelerators. And the finally last slide is about the fact that the 17th goal is about partnership and multi-stakeholder approaches. And these goals will be very costly. They cost already between $3.5 to $4 trillion a year. I don't even know how many zeros it is, but $2.5 trillion is expected to be leveraged from the private sector and philanthropy. And that obviously, this really requires a completely different approach to working on sustainable development. And the project that Lauren mentioned, the SDG Philanthropy Platform, is such a platform. Is an initiative that Foundation Center, UNDP, and Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, with support from Ford Foundation, Hilton, and MasterCard, is pursuing to show that the collaboration around SDGs will be beneficial to all the philanthropy. Philanthropy can find themselves and can find SDGs useful because it enhances their development impact through collaboration. And they use the SDG taxonomy for their own work to find partners, to leverage resources of others, and to make their investment much more far-reaching. Thank you very much. And I give the floor to Jeff.
Thank you, Karolina. Happy to be here virtually to talk a little bit more about what we've already heard, but also to give a perspective from USAID on the 2030 agenda and the SDGs. And I have on this opening slide here a quote from the President, which he delivered last September at the UN Sustainable Development Summit that indicates the strong commitment of the U.S. government to the SDGs. He said, we commit ourselves to the new Sustainable Development Goals, understanding how difficult the task is, but also reaffirming that supporting development really is not about charity, but instead is one of the smartest investments we can make in our own future. And I think that's a strong statement and one that we're trying to carry forward at USAID. So let me tell you some of the things that USAID finds particularly exciting about this new global agenda for development. So this took a long time to accomplish. The process of debating and negotiating these goals took several years, but they also brought in voices from civil society, from the private sector, NGOs, think tanks, philanthropy, from individual citizens, and also from governments, but not just from donor countries, from developing countries as well. So this was really a truly inclusive process that was really unparalleled at the UN. And in the end, because so many voices contributed, all 193 UN member states signed up to the goals. And for that reason, all countries are going to be held accountable for demonstrating progress towards the goals. So what that means is that this is an agenda that is owned by all governments and really the global community. It's not something that developed countries decided developing countries needed to do, which was a criticism of the MDGs. It's not something that governments decided without the input of citizens. Everybody really has a stake in this and is going to be held accountable to achieving the goals, which means that to succeed, everybody has a role to play in investing in achieving those goals. They really are our commitment to the next generation. And the leave no one behind part of the agenda, as Karolina said, is very powerful. We're not just talking about improving the lives of particular segments of the society or the easiest to reach. We're talking about making real transformative change. We're eradicating poverty and hunger, ensuring access to water and energy for all, achieving gender equality for all, promoting peace, and providing access to justice for all. These are really goals that touch every person, regardless of ethnicity, gender, orientation, geography, disability, race, or any other status. And they mark a commitment to universal human rights and basic economic opportunities across the globe. And also, leaving no one behind means really that we have to integrate environmental sustainability and climate efforts into all of our development efforts across the board. And finally, this is, as the previous presenters have said, a universal agenda. The focus of the MDGs had been primarily on developing countries, but the SDGs apply to all countries, and all countries will be expected to report on their progress. And in fact, in many of the conversations we're having with other governments, both donor and developing countries, we find that they are as interested in what the U.S. is doing domestically to implement the SDGs and in how we're orienting our foreign assistance to support implementation in other countries. So with those elements as kind of our guiding principles, let me turn now to how we're working to support implementation as U.S. aid of the SDGs in our partner countries. First of all, we were very active during the conversation and negotiations surrounding the agenda to ensure that the SDGs reflect our own longstanding priorities for development and our understanding of what drives development progress. So much of what we're already doing in our ongoing efforts at USAID are already well aligned with the SDGs. And because our priorities are embedded in the framework, and because of the political consensus behind the SDGs, these are really an opportunity to build on and elevate our existing initiatives and priorities. And that includes everything we're doing in the areas of democracy and good governance, global health, food security, gender, energy, education, economic growth, climate change, biodiversity, all of those areas that we championed for inclusion in the agenda and that we see as the foundation of development progress. And those are all individual issues, but we also take very seriously the breadth and integration of the goals and targets and the recognition of the agenda that economic development, human and social development, and environmental protection are intrinsically linked and interconnected. So we're challenging ourselves to think about how our work applies across the agenda and how we can facilitate cross-pollination of efforts. So if you take our food security programming, for example, under Feed the Future, these are approaches that are most clearly aligned, most obviously aligned with the hunger goal, with the poverty goal. But we're also thinking about how those efforts support progress on gender equality, Goal 5, or economic growth, Goal 8, effective governance, but also other goals dealing with climate, energy, ecosystems. So how can what we're already doing help make advance progress on other goals? Because we know that without progress on one, we won't be able to make progress on the others. These are all very closely linked. As another example, we have colleagues in the Global Health Bureau who recently authored a paper that demonstrates how investments in family planning can accelerate achievement across the entire goal framework. And our primary focus is on helping, as USAID, on helping partner countries implement and achieve the SDGs by building capacities and supporting country-led approaches and local solutions. And so one step we're taking is ensuring that our 5-year country strategies, our country development cooperation strategies, will acknowledge how they will support SDG implementation in country. So I'm trying to move forward, but I don't see the slide on my screen. But let me see if anything changes. There we go. Okay. So we've been using those principles to sort of move forward to engage our missions in the field. We've been conducting outreach to get a more granular sense of how countries we partner with have been preparing to incorporate the SDGs into their development plans, into their budgeting strategies, and how and to what extent our missions are already involved in helping on the ground. And we found that in some countries, implementation planning is well underway. In other countries, we're seeing slower progress. But we're trying to use the opportunity that the SDGs provide to unlock the constraints that are keeping people from proceeding on implementation and to rally action and support for the agenda, both among government partners and with civil societies. An important part of how we think about achieving the SDGs and strengthening country ownership will be through implementation of the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which is all about how these get resourced and the means of implementation for the agenda. This includes mobilizing 3 primary streams of capital. That's official development assistance that countries provide, also international private investment, and importantly, domestic resources that are mobilized by countries themselves. All of these are vital to implementing and achieving the SDGs, and so is leveraging science, technology, and innovation to make our investments more sustainable, longer lasting, and more effective. Finally, the SDGs require an approach to development that leverages the leadership, the resources, the partnerships from all sectors of society. That includes private sector, civil society, philanthropy, academia, faith-based organizations, and individual citizens themselves. And so we're investing in key partnerships that we think are going to be critical to advancing progress on the agenda, and we're looking for new ways to partner to achieve these goals. And that is where foundations and philanthropies and other civil society organizations come in, because every organization has a role to play in this effort. We've already seen the numbers that philanthropy provides across the agenda. U.S. philanthropy makes investments in developing countries at a number that is equivalent to what the U.S. government provides in official development assistance, which is over $30 billion a year. And so active engagement by philanthropic organizations and large NGOs can advance a modern approach to financing development by demonstrating that the implementation of the SDGs not only requires the resources, but actually benefits from organizations beyond just governments themselves. And many foundations are also well positioned to highlight the universal nature of the SDGs by identifying the connections between investments that are made internationally and investments that are made domestically in our own countries. So a number of the targets in the SDGs are really squarely about developing countries. So for example, the first target to end extreme poverty at $1.90 a day is very specific to developing country context. But other targets are applicable to a whole bunch of other countries. So right next to the extreme poverty target is a target on cutting poverty in half according to national poverty line. So that's clearly relevant within the U.S. And every other country in the world. And those are the kinds of issues that could benefit from knowledge sharing and collaboration and really breaking down silos between organizations and within organizations that separate international and domestic activities and divide the substantive issues such as health, governance, and food security from a more holistic and integrated approach. And finally, as we've heard, data is extremely important. Access to timely, accurate, and accessible data will really make it possible to make and measure progress over the next 15 years. Data is a starting point for every organization, and it's a starting point for efforts on this agenda. And sharing and making data accessible will go a long way towards enabling policymakers, funders, implementers, and beneficiaries themselves, making them able to make better decisions about where development dollars can have the greatest impact and what solutions are best suited for local governments. And within the U.S. government, we take this need for a data revolution very seriously, and we're investing in a partnership on data to enable effective implementation of the agenda. So that's the view from USAID. I will leave it there, and I will pass it on to Anna Marie.
Terrific. Well, thank you very much. My tasks were twofold for this afternoon. One was to explain why the goals will be relevant to the Ford Foundation in particular, and maybe entice you as funders who work in a variety of issues to think about how they might be relevant to your work. And then as part of that, I will also provide an example as how we're concretely using the goals in our work. I wanted to preface it by saying that I was particularly excited to see the Twitter feed because it was you work hard, now connect your work to the SDGs, and I was like, yep. The SDGs for us here at the Ford Foundation have been very exciting because it's an opportunity to not just be more collaborative and more productive, but really to refine our goals as part of our new strategy rethink and also to accelerate our goals. So we first became engaged in the SDGs early. I would say it was back in 2013, and it was actually just a casual conversation. I was in Washington, D.C., and we heard actually Jeff and his colleagues talking about this thing that was going to be the successor to the Millennium Development Goals, which we had never heard about because the Millennium Development Goals were really for the global south and weren't relevant to the U.S. They were talking about this being a little bit different, and so for organizations that were not usually interested in these cryptic global intergovernmental processes, our ears were up. And what caught our attention is what's been mentioned before, is that it was going to be universal. And part of that was that meant that this was going to be trickling down to us, whether we work at the national level or the regional level or the local level, it was coming. And so we had the choice of being reactive or proactive, knowing that our country here, the U.S., was going to be accountable. They would be asking us for reporting. And so by getting on top of it early, we were able to shape what we would be reporting on later. So that was of interest for this next generation of what was in the Millennium Development Goals. It was also intriguing because it was an opportunity to work in a cross-cutting way, in an interdisciplinary way. We had a brand new president, Darren Walker, and Darren was pushing us to think about systems instead of silos. We had like 38 lines of work back then, and he was saying that's too much, and these are band-aids. We need to think about the systems and the interlinked issues of inequality, climate change, and economic growth. So this was very interesting because the SDGs were thinking this way, and so they held the potential to offer tools for implementation for us to work concurrently on these important elements which we were focused on. And also we thought about the public will that could be built around these critical priorities that were really important for the next generation. And so we also saw opportunities to scale good practice. Jeffrey alluded to this in his presentation about sharing with other countries. And what I mean about scaling good practice is a lot of us in philanthropy have work on the ground. We know a little bit about what works. We have lots of lessons to share after years of grant making, and through the SDGs, if it was truly global, we could be sharing it not just with, the neighbors down the street, but what, Detroit can share with Milan, and Milan can share with Turkey. It's just there's a lot of sharing going around in the urban in this new global environment. It was also an opportunity to contribute to good policy, and by good policy, I mean mainstreaming what's great policy in one place and making it the new normal for a whole bunch of places. And by that, we're creating a global enabling environment for lots of really good work, and an environment where governments across vertical layers like national, state, regional, local are really working in the same direction and are complementing each other. So there was it was like a trifecta, right? We were able to influence what the SDGs were going to include, to inform what they were going to include, and inform each other. And also really with the SDGs, if we're all working around the same priorities and global priorities, we can really leverage each other. Next slide. And so how are we actually using it? We used it as part of our Ford Forward strategy, and we're using it in my team, which is the Equitable Development team. We see that the world is quickly urbanizing, and it's urbanizing fast. We see that we're all going from crisis to crisis and from problem to problem. And so what we're doing at the Ford Foundation is, at least my shop, we're focusing on inequality, and we're focusing on spatial inequality, and we're working on place. And by doing that, we think that we can really disrupt inequality because we're working around systems. And what was a big win for us was that there was a goal 11. Goal 11 was the goal that's focused on cities and human settlements. It's a big win because it gives us the platform to work on urbanization and urban development and on urban-rural linkages and things like that, all the things that people need to thrive in place. But it also shows us, when you look at the SDGs, the tremendous overlap that they include. So if you were to evaluate the different indicators, there's 15 indicators out of the, how many did you say there were, Karolina? I think 179 or something. Of those, 15 are only for goal 11. But if you look at how they're relevant and interdependent, you cannot achieve the goals, achieve your work or accelerate your work if you don't pay attention to the other areas. So it forces us to pay attention to and work to achieve the other targets, because you cannot achieve one set of targets without looking at the others. It forces us to work around systems, and that is very exciting to us here at the Ford Foundation, and I hope to you as well. Now, I would be lying if I didn't say that even now that we're fully involved in the SDGs, that we didn't always have a healthy amount of skepticism. It really requires a leap of faith to get involved in these UN processes. You know, we've seen that sometimes there's a lot of nice reports that have no teeth. And so we've taken this to our board and said, what do you think? Is it worth the involvement? I think that right now it's a special time, and it's a sweet spot, a special moment in time, because the Sustainable Development Goals are not happening in a vacuum. We had the Sustainable Development Goals, which were negotiated and approved, as my colleague said, last September. But then those were followed by the Paris Agreement, the COP21, in December. And there's another implementing conference, which is happening in October. The three of these together have really taken the attention of of our federal governments across, the developed and the developing world, and everybody is thinking about how do we work around systems, how do we work together, how do we implement, monitor, and review. And so we have an unprecedented opportunity, given that we have this global public resolve to do something. People are tired of going from crisis to crisis, and they are tired of putting bandages, and so they're really working around systems. So this is exciting for us, and that's why we did it. We've invested in different kinds of things as part of the Sustainable Development Goals implementation. Karolina talked about the philanthropy platform. That's particularly exciting because it gives us an incredible head start in self-organizing the philanthropic sector, so that we are not being, we're not having to collect data at the last moment. We are able to develop data since like 2 years before the goals were even accepted, and we're also able to work on country pilots, and that's a little cryptic, but what that means is that we're sitting at the table with countries as they develop their commissions and they develop their panels that will be monitoring and reviewing the accountability of all of us to get to these goals. So that's exciting as well. And so I will end by sharing a brief story, and it's really part of our creation story of the Ford Foundation. It dates back to the 1940s, and it's on our website, so I'll give you the brief clip notes. But it was a key evolution moment for us. And that's when Henry Ford died in the 1940s, and he left for the Ford Foundation, what was back then a little, as you see, little tiny one little house with 2 stories. That was the entire Ford Foundation back then. And overnight he left a sizable bequest which turned this little tiny foundation into the world's largest philanthropy. The trustees were, rightly so, they were like completely daunted by this task of what do we do? How do we be responsible? And so they turned to a blue ribbon panel of global experts, and these global experts took several years, and they were charged with identifying the most pressing problems of that generation. They were charged with developing metrics and also recommending opportunities for focus for the next generation of the Ford Foundation. This was called the Geisler Report, and it's really how we pivoted to become a foundation that was a social justice funder, and it's been our blueprint for action all these years. And what I would posit to you is that by luck, not because the Ford Foundation trustees, they commissioned that report for philanthropy, and they knew that this was going to be critical. But we have stumbled into a collective opportunity with a collective, the equivalent of a Geisler report for our next generation. It gives us what are really the pressing priorities of our time. They're systems-oriented, they're evidence-based, they're based on a long and very engaged participatory process that included academic experts, residents on the street, philanthropies. There were lots of groups, farm workers, women, youth that were involved in putting this together. And so it gives us an amazing blueprint for investing, implementing, monitoring, really collaborating that is unparalleled. It's aspirational, which is great, and it's practical, which is great. And so we are encouraged, and we would encourage you to think about it as well, and to think about how you can bring it to the ground in our communities here in the U.S. or wherever it is that you happen to work. And with that, I thank you very much for your time, and I'll entertain questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna Marie, Jeffrey, and Karolina, for what was a really useful overview. So we're just collating the questions now. I think we've got quite a few in here. And while that happens, I just want to touch briefly on the data subject again, which each speaker has come to in their remarks, and which is really key to the SDG agenda. Because without the data, we can't measure where the financial flows are going, we can't measure the impact of programs, and we can't see who is doing what, where, and how to partner. And so we mentioned that there are 231 SDG indicators at the moment, and those indicators are really important and really useful because they can be used across all sectors. So 231 indicators sounds like a lot, but when you're only working on 1 or 2 or 3 themes and it starts to break down, then that's not so many indicators that relate to your work. So it is manageable. And these indicators, if each organization uses them to measure their work in addition to their own individual organizational indicators, then we can start to compare basically results across sectors. So we can see that what government is seeing happening in the country, we can see what foundation sector is doing in the country, we can see private sector results, civil society, etc. So I just want everyone to keep that in mind. And now I think we are going to switch to Tanaja actually to ask the questions because we're having a bit of an issue with the Q&A function. So I hope that's right.
Yes, there are a lot of questions coming in, and so there's not enough time for us to answer them all specifically, so I've categorized them so that we can sort of try to speak to everyone's question as efficiently as possible. A lot of folks are asking questions related to partnerships and funding. Some folks are wondering where they can find info regarding which specific organizations have funded a particular SDG.
Okay, so do each of the speakers want to give a few comments around partnerships, working in partnerships? I'll just touch on the information about how you can see which organizations are funding which SDG, which is on sdgfunders.org, and hand over to the panelists now to elaborate a bit more on the partnership question. And is there anything else? Sorry, I didn't entirely hear the specific question.
I can start that off. This is Ana Mari. We've been partnering with other philanthropies, both here in the U.S. with affinity groups as well. And for example, the European Foundation Center has something called the Funders Forum for Sustainable Cities, and that is a platform which includes foundations from all across the world. And they've been thinking about how to use the SDGs, and we've been thinking about how to co-fund and how to collaborate more closely. We also, given that they're so interconnected, the folks that are working on Goal 11 are working with, for example, the Environmental Grant Makers Association, because the built environment in cities is so related to climate and climate change and decarbonizing. We're working with multilaterals like the OECD and the big development banks like the World Bank, because it gives us a way to then organize concretely around, what are a set of 15 indicators and targets, and from there then we can find common ground.
Great.
Thank you.
I actually do see some of the questions now. So one is, how do you measure impact and connect them to the policies and programs? And how do you measure co-benefits and trade-offs? So Karolina or Jeff, perhaps you could touch on that question about measuring impact and connecting it to policies and programs.
Yes, I will maybe take the first one about the impact. And again, I would go back to the lessons learned from the MDGs, Millennium Development Goals, and how we, for example, learn the impact. Let's say regarding maternal mortality. Actually, this was one of the goals that hasn't been reached because we haven't reached the number of women that are still dying, unfortunately, from child-related health issues. But what was interesting is to really understand, and using the system thinking that Ana Marie was talking about, we were able to really understand what were the pressure points and how to create the kind of outcomes we want, i.e. the decrease of the number of deaths among women. And one of the, for example, an interesting indicators was that most of women in developing world couldn't really get, one of the bottlenecks which they experienced, they couldn't really get to the closest health clinic, because they just didn't have a transport. So first thing, we were trying to analyze what were the kind of bottlenecks that were preventing women to use the health services, and second, were they really using them efficiently, and the third, what was the outcome on issues related to mothers, health of mothers, as well as the health of children. So it was a very broad systems thinking that we were using something which was called the SDG acceleration format, which we are now, we're applying the same kind of thinking in using the Sustainable Development Goals. And right. I just want to say one more thing regarding the previous response about financing. Each country right now has something which is called the Millennium Development Goals Progress Report, which is also a baseline for Sustainable Development Goals. And if you look into this report, you see which donors are funding mostly what kind of goals, which is interesting. That's this shows what has been happening so far. What we also see is what are the kind of goals which are receiving a lot of funding and what are the kind of goals which are not receiving a lot of funding. That's something which, that's particular area of interest that we should take care as funders to really make sure that we don't have these SDGs which are orphans. Thank you. Jeff, over to
Okay,
you.
Jeff, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I would agree with a lot of that. I think we're really interested in looking not at what's going on goal by goal, because we're doing a lot of that well, and a lot of organizations are doing that well. We're interested in where we can find synergies for an integrated agenda that really moves the development needle forward as a whole. And so one of the things on measurement and evaluation that this agenda really offers is kind of a learning agenda for how integrated development works. And that's kind of exciting, and it's something I think that a lot of organizations can bring. And there's a growing body of evidence looking at systems, looking at integrated programs, what kind of cash transfers work with what kind of training programs, and we need to build on that learning now and going forward and do more to compare across program designs and exploring new methods and being innovative in our evaluation methods. We're using real-time data and managing our programs adaptively to make sure that we're correcting our approaches in real time. So I think there's a real opportunity here to advance our understanding of measurement and evaluation on an integrated development agenda.
It gives us a great platform. For example, Goal 11 that I was talking about before, it gives you concrete targets for safe, decent, affordable housing, safe, decent, affordable transit and mobility, national urban policy, which I think there's only 2 countries in the world that right now have a national urban policy in place. That's not the U.S., right? What's the amount of accessible green and public space that cities should have? What are the linkages? These are all quantifiable, so it gives us a start as to how to look at that, how to look at resilience, for example, and how to measure resilience. So, for example, the Rockefeller Foundation, kudos to them for helping us work on that. It is, if you look at the targets, they're terrific.
Okay, and Anna Marie, there's a question that sort of builds on that, which is specifically to Ford Foundation and asking how Ford makes decisions in relation to the SDGs, and you're only focusing on Goal 11, or you're looking at all of the goals, and can you sort of explain what the goals mean for your funding?
Sure. So Goal 11, I focused on that because I wanted to give one concrete example, and that's the work that I do, which is equitable development. But there's 17 goals. I would point to Goal 10, which is reduced inequalities. That's not a coincidence that we're working, that our macro work, our guiding star is reducing inequalities. So that's directly relevant. And then that's our meta narrative there, that Goal 10. I focused on Goal 11 because that's what we do, but we also are working on Goal 5, which is gender equality. We're working on quality education because we have the youth opportunity and learning folks. Our work in here in equitable development really works on poverty, but we also have colleagues that work on, which is no poverty is number 1. Goal number 8 is decent work, so we're doing that. I have colleagues that are working on climate change, so that's directly in the number Goal 13. So yes, we're working along many of these, and what we're trying to do is not just stay in our little box, but really work together given the systems and the interdependence and the linkages within all of these.
Great, thank you. And now there's a couple of questions coming in here about the SDGs in the US, and I might just touch on that first briefly because it relates to some work that I've been doing, and then I'd ask the other panelists to jump in on that as well because you've all sort of been involved in some way in that work. So there's a question essentially asking how does implementation of the SDGs happen in the US and how will that be coordinated? And I'll leave Jeff to talk about the government side of things, which is coming from state anyway. But just so everyone knows on the call, the SDG Philanthropy Platform and Foundation Center have been working closely with the Council on Foundations and Ford and USAID and state and others to facilitate conversations in the US around the SDGs and how they're applicable domestically to philanthropy. And there will be a report coming out in July on the findings of those meetings, which were in Little Rock, San Francisco, New York, and just last week we had a meeting of affinity groups. And so that will include the findings in that report. And I'm happy to talk about that offline with anyone else. But Anna Marie, Jeff, or Karolina, do you have anything else to add to the US SDG component? And then we'll probably have to wrap up soon.
Well, so I can speak a little bit to the kinds of things we're thinking about. We're doing a lot of work within USAID thinking about our foreign assistance side. On the domestic side, I think as Karolina mentioned, the first step really is identifying where we're already aligned with the agenda. And so the White House, through the Office of the Chief Statistician, has been leading those efforts to reach out to domestic agencies to identify where we have data that can allow us to report on the indicators associated with the goals and targets. And so we've begun to collect the data to identify where we're already aligned with the agenda and where the gaps might be. And we are committed as a government to leading by example. At the Sustainable Development Summit last year, we used the opportunity of the adoption of the SDGs to showcase how we're focusing on Goal 16 within the U.S., and we highlighted a White House memorandum on access to justice and legal aid within the U.S. And then I think also, as Anna Marie mentioned, the upcoming Habitat 3 conference on sustainable urbanization and housing will be an opportunity for our cities within the U.S., many of which are also aligning their local development plans to the SDGs, cities like New York and Baltimore, to tell the story of how we are moving forward on implementation of Goal 11 and other goals within the U.S. So those are kind of a few of the ideas of how we're working towards implementation domestically.
Great. Anna Marie, do you want to add something as well to the domestic context?
No, I think you all covered it well.
Okay, great. So I think we're nearly at time. I'm wondering if Tanaja has the poll results there or not. Here they are. I'm just going to quickly look at the poll results based on, and not everyone, I believe, has filled out the poll, but it looks like there's a good turnout. So it sounds like the majority of participants on the webinar today have indicated that Goal 3, good health and well-being, and Goal 4, quality education, what they are working on within their own organizations, which is really interesting to us. So without further ado, I'd like to thank all of our excellent panelists today. For anyone on the line listening, we'll be sending the materials around. And huge thanks to everyone for joining. I just asked Tanaja if there's anything else that she would like to say to wrap up.
Yes, just wanted to share the information regarding the survey link. You should be able to update that. You should be able to share your feedback regarding the webinar. This link is also going to be emailed to you with the recording.
Great. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. And please use the SDGs as a framework in your work. They're really valuable and relevant to all of us. Thanks again.